Picture a hunter-gatherer camp 100,000 years ago, and you probably picture something out of a bad movie. A hulking chief barking orders. Anyone who steps out of line gets crushed, beaten, or thrown out on his command. Might makes right, and right belongs to whoever's strongest. It's a satisfying story. It's also almost completely wrong. The people who actually lived this way built something far stranger, far more democratic, and far more ruthless than a single tyrant ever could. In the 1990s, anthropologist Christopher Boehm set out to answer a question that had bothered him for years. If humans evolved from primate ancestors organized around dominant alpha males, why do so many hunter-gatherer societies look nothing like that? Why do foraging bands actively humiliate anyone who tries to boss the group around? Boehm combed through ethnographic records on foraging societies across Africa, Asia, South America, and Australia, looking for patterns in how these groups actually handled people who broke the rules. What he found upended the standard story of ancient hierarchy completely. He called it reverse dominance hierarchy. In a typical primate troop, the strongest, most aggressive male usually wins. But in human foraging bands, the entire group organizes itself specifically to prevent that outcome. The moment someone starts acting like a bully, hoarding meat, bossing others around, threatening people, the rest of the band doesn't wait for a leader to intervene. They intervene themselves, collectively, and the tools they use are not what you'd expect from a violent, primitive world. The first tool was talk. Simple, relentless, humiliating talk. Anthropologist Richard Lee, who spent years living among the Jew/Hoansi San of the Kalahari, documented this directly. When a hunter returned from a successful kill and started acting proud about it, the rest of camp didn't praise him. They mocked him. They called his kill scrawny, worthless, barely worth the effort of carrying home. Lee asked why, and one hunter explained it plainly. When a young man boasts, they said, his heart grows too big, and one day he thinks he's the chief and starts giving orders to everyone else. So they cut him down on purpose every single time before that could happen. But mockery was just the opening move. If gossip and ridicule didn't work, if someone kept pushing, kept bullying, kept taking more than their share, the band escalated. The next step was shunning. People would stop sharing food with the offender, they'd stop including him in hunts, they'd talk about him as though he weren't there. In a world with no supermarkets, no money, and no way to survive outside the cooperation of the group, social exile was not a minor inconvenience. It was a slow sentence. Cut off from the band's food-sharing network, an exiled individual's odds of survival collapsed within weeks. And if that still didn't work, if someone was violent enough, dangerous enough, repeatedly enough, the band had one final option, and it's the part of this story that rarely makes it into the popular imagination. They killed him, not through a duel, not through the decision of one strongman, through consensus. Richard Lee documented exactly this happening among the San. A man named /Twy had assaulted and killed several people over the years, and the community had tried everything else first. Ridicule, warnings, ostracism. Nothing stopped him. Eventually, the men of several bands agreed together, quietly, that he had to die. They ambushed him and killed him as a group, with everyone present sharing in the act. No single person struck the fatal blow alone, and no single person bore the blame alone either. Boehm found this same pattern repeated across dozens of unrelated foraging societies on different continents. When a bully or a killer became too dangerous to control any other way, the group didn't wait for a chief's permission. The group became the judge, and everyone shared the verdict. Execution was always the last resort, not the default. Many foraging and early tribal societies preferred a completely different route, compensation instead of violence. Legal anthropologists studying groups from the Nuer of South Sudan to various indigenous Australian communities documented systems where a killing or serious injury could be settled through payment, livestock, tools, or valuables handed over to the victim's family, rather than escalating into a blood feud. The goal wasn't to punish the offender for its own sake, it was to restore balance to the group, to make the victim's family whole enough that they wouldn't feel compelled to retaliate. In many of these societies, refusing to accept a fair compensation offer was itself seen as socially unacceptable. a way of prolonging conflict the entire community had already agreed should end. Execution was reserved for the cases compensation couldn't fix, the repeat offenders, the ones who took the payment and did it again anyway. Here's what should stop you cold about this. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't mob violence in the way we usually picture it. It was slow, deliberate, and collective, specifically because collective action solved a problem that no lone executioner could. If one man alone killed the bully, that man's family might seek revenge, and the cycle of violence would spiral forever. But if the entire camp decided together and struck together, there was no single target left for revenge. The punishment was designed, whether anyone realized it consciously or not, to end violence rather than extend it. But why would this specific pattern show up again and again in societies with no contact with each other across tens of thousands of years? In 2019, primatologist Richard Wrangham proposed an answer that reframes the entire story. In his book, The Goodness Paradox, Wrangham argued that this coalition-based execution of bullies wasn't just a clever social workaround, it was a selective pressure. Generation after generation, the most aggressive, most domineering, most violent men were the ones most likely to be identified, ganged up on, and killed by the rest of the group. Their genes and their temperament were removed from the population. Meanwhile, men who were cooperative enough to avoid becoming a target and calm enough to join the coalition against those who didn't, survived and reproduced. Wrangham calls this self-domestication, and the evidence for it shows up in our bodies, not just our behavior. Compared to our closest primate relatives, humans have dramatically lower reactive aggression, the kind of impulsive violence that erupts in the heat of the moment. Our faces are softer, our brow ridges smaller, our hormone profiles calmer, all changes that mirror what happens when animals like foxes or dogs are domesticated over generations. In 2014, anthropologist Robert Cieri and his colleagues measured this directly, analyzing hundreds of skulls spanning roughly 200,000 years of human history. They found a clear, steady reduction in brow ridge size and a rounding of the face, changes strongly linked to lower testosterone reactivity, becoming more pronounced right around the time larger, more socially complex, more cooperative human settlements began appearing. Our faces quite literally softened as our tolerance for aggressive dominance dropped. But here's the paradox in the title. While our day-to-day aggression dropped, our capacity for planned coalitional violence, exactly the kind used in these group executions, didn't disappear at all. It may have gotten sharper. We became at the same time gentler with each other and more capable of organized violence against anyone the group decided to turn on. So the ancient justice system wasn't a crude forerunner to modern courts. In some ways, it was more sophisticated than what came after it. There was no judge who could be bribed. No chief whose word was law simply because he held a spear. Justice was distributed, collective, and nearly impossible for any one person to hijack for personal gain. The price of that system was steep. It meant conformity was enforced, sometimes brutally, and standing out too much, even by being too successful, could get you targeted. But it also meant that for the vast majority of human history, no single tyrant could seize permanent control of a group of people who had spears of their own, and a shared willingness to use them. You can still feel the machinery of this system running today, even if the stakes are lower now. The instinct to gossip about someone who's gotten too big for their britches, the impulse to pile on when someone violates a group's unwritten rules, the quiet social freeze-out that happens to people who take too much and give too little. None of that is petty modern pettiness. It's the same reverse dominance hierarchy your ancestors built to survive, still running in a world that no longer requires it, still enforcing rules nobody wrote down, still occasionally deciding together that someone has to be cut down to size.